going to present in this session on microliths a recently, let's say, excavated, not precisely, but subsurface surveyed assemblages from the Bas Con, and also present you with the general criteria that I have been using whilst looking at the material from this area of the Bas Con in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I am referring to the publication or the introduction by Els Cornelissen in 2002 on what they propose as criteria for describing microlithic assemblages. There is the proliferation of bladelet and microblade techniques, the fact that there are retouched implements and that the retouch serves to blunt rather than to sharpen the artifacts or the implements, that the combination of these two leads to more standardization both in shape and in size, or in shape and size, that microlithic pieces tend to make up a substantial and often numerically dominant component of lithic assemblages described as microlithic, although they are used along with microlithic tools. And then also, of course, that microliths are used in composite tools. The data that I will be presenting, on one hand the quartz assemblages, and on the other hand the Chitolean from the Bas Con, you will see that one of these, the Chitolean, corresponds rather nicely to these criteria, whereas the quartz assemblages don't at all correspond to that. Now, the area I will be talking about is the Bas Con, the most western part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. As you can see, this area is relatively well covered with archaeological sites compared to the rest of the country, but very much also here it's an archaeology of presence and absence. It's not an overwhelming offer of well-dated sites in stratigraphy. Now, the Bas Con is known ever since the late 19th century for the surface collections and the pieces that are literally littering the place, which are made in grès-polymorphe, or a polymorphic sandstone, which is available in all kinds of sizes, small nodules, but also very big ones, and has been used for bifacially flaked implements of the Sangoan, Lupemban, Chitolean tradition. So this very much to insist that also in this area, quartz is not a matter of a last resort or being used because there is nothing else available. However, these quartz assemblages are not very visible in the, let's say, surface collections. And Bas Con, that's the same all over the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in fact, there is now a project, a Congo Kingdom project running in the Bas Con, that has nothing to do with Stone Age research, but is looking for the origins of the Congo Kingdom. But during the excavations for stratigraphic position of the graves and the churches and the walls they found, they also collected quartz industry or stone or lithic artifacts, and they also dated on one of these sites, Ngongo Mbata, the lithics to approximately 9,000 years ago. So we're in the Holocene. That's also the scope, the chronological scope of my presentation. It's the Holocene in between, let's say, 12,000 and 3,000. Now, it has been published last year in a more general presentation of the project as artifacts of late Stone Age origin associated to microlithic quartz debitage. The charcoal was dated to 9,470. And the question of the team of Congo King was for me to look at this lithic material, to study and analyze it. So it's a very timely opportunity, this workshop on microlithic, to describe and to look into more detail of these lithics. For quartz in general, usually it is said it looks microlithic because the blanks are that small, and because of its shattering nature, let's say, that it breaks away in small portions. Now, the site I will be talking about is situated over here, in Ngongo Mbata, one of the many sites of the sites over here that yielded some of these lithic assemblages in the south of Bas Con. on the slide here, you don't see it very well, but these are the big trenches that were dug for the project itself, and the graph in Excel table, which is presented above it, is the presence of the lithic artifacts throughout these various trenches, and each column of an Excel file corresponds to a square meter, and in the grey shaded areas are the numbers of lithic artifacts that were collected throughout the sediment. In the red colored square, the spits, in fact, the lines in the Excel graph are 10 to 20 centimeter spits, and the date comes from a depth between 120 and 140 centimeters below surface. There are at about 785 artifacts, and thereof 88% was made of quartz, generally speaking. That means vein quartz, milky quartz, and also to some extent glass quartz or the crystal quartz. Another feature that is very apparent looking at this material is the very high proportion of cortex on all of the artifacts, and as we will see, regardless of size and regardless of type. In general, the largest size classes that are found in both raw materials, that means there is a smaller portion of other raw materials which are more like the silicified mudstone or the finer grained flint-like raw materials. And you see that the size distribution of these two groups of raw materials here at this site is approximately the same, although the other raw materials in general on a regional scale are also present in much larger blocks and much larger blanks. Now, when comparing all the other raw materials, there's only 90 of them, to the 695 artifacts in quartz, arranged according to size expressed in centimeters, you see that the no cortex here with the quartz is up to 2 centimeters, but that there is a vast majority of cortical pieces. So what do they look like? Which does not correspond with the other raw materials, where you see that the cortex is more evenly spread and, let's say, becomes more important, which would be logical if you want to get rid of your cortex in the larger size classes. I think it's the idea of cortex being not a thing to get rid of was expressed in 1997 by Bas Con when studying quartz industries, and using the term of neocortex, in which he pointed to the smooth and regular surface of quartz cobbles that do not need any preparation per se to be used as a flaking platform. In fact, the cortex, which is a smoother surface or a better surface in a way to guide a the debitage, is instead of the quartz when it has no cortex and sort of splinters in a lot of side effects. And also, in his opinion, and I agree with that, it is not necessarily something that is archaic, but something that is exploited, something that is in a way sought after in this kind of raw material. If we break down the quartz and the flakes, again according to their size and the cortex, then in general you could say that a typical, once again, it's subsurface survey, so I'm not pretending that these are very well preserved old or ancient surfaces, but it is a general way of getting an idea of what a quartz industry in the Bas Congo may look like. A common feature is a split cobble, which is then flaked on the part that has no cortex in a radial pattern. They have a typical planar convex cross section, with the convex side, of course, being the original part of the cobble. There are a few refits, it's maybe not worthwhile mentioning, but 4 times 2 artifacts and 1 time 5 artifacts, and these 5 artifacts are within getting into the quartz nodule. There is also one of these smaller cores with a flake type 3 that fits onto that core. The flakes are arranged, I think that's a common way of looking. If you look at Cortex, the organization that Nick Toth has proposed for all the one assemblages, but which really nicely takes into account the portion of cortex on the dorsal surface and the portion of cortex on the flaking platform. The flakes here of Ngongo and Bata are organized in those that carry cortex on their platform and those that have no cortex on their platform. And as you can see, these with cortex are really prevalent in all size classes. Even so, the one which with the type 3, which is a flake that has no cortex on the dorsal surface and has cortex on the flaking platform, is very prevalent. It represents approximately 50% of the flake population. There are some modified pieces, I would call them, which have retouched notches, some have scraper edges, but there is no consistency, or there is no typical blade or flake or cobble that has been used as a blank. And as you can see, again, many of these artifacts also carry cortex, but they are not standardized in any way, be it in size or be it in shape. I would like to remind you, I did that in 2014 at the workshop at Johannesburg, that for quartz there is this one object that contains an insert in quartz. It's 8 millimeters wide, and it sits in a bone, an engraved bone, but the myths and the mats I'm not going to talk about. But I think it's very important to see that quartz, unmodified quartz, has been used in this particular way already 20,000 years ago. Now, in general, the other raw materials, and I'm only presenting them in large categories of flakes, quartz, modified, and tools. You see that within the tools there's only 5 of them, but 2 of them could classify as microliths. One of them, it's not, I'm sorry for the quality of the pictures, this one has a small backed side, whereas this one, it's not a blade fragment, it's in fact a rectangular flake with a slightly hinged terminal release and some retouch on one of the edges. So it's not blunted, or it's not backed in the proper sense of the word. Now, to make the point about this being a intentional and a deliberate choice for quartz, and to prepare, or to prepare not, but to use these quartz nodules to obtain this kind of small flakes, I would like to present the other lithic tradition that is present in that area within the same time span. And I'm using the site of the Plateau Bateke to give you an impression of what the Chitolian looks like. This comes from an excavation already in 1959. It has yielded an assemblage of 4,631 artifacts, and practically all of them are in polymorphic sandstone. So there is 1% other raw materials, and within these other raw materials, a very small portion, there is also quartz. The Chitolian in the area, so not specifically on this site, has been dated somewhere between 12,000 and 3,000, so it's contemporary with these quartz dates, for which Bernard Kliss told me that he has a second date which also goes around 8,000, so that confirms the date of 9,000. So what does this industry look like? First of all, there is no blade or blade-like quartz like for the quartz assemblages, and there is the radial flaking platform, but much more to obtain specific flakes or Levallois. What you see here, the larger block, the Levallois core, is in polymorphic sandstone in a rather mint condition, so it's very colorful, yellowish, reddish colors. And the one below is the same raw material, but patinated, which is a very specific feature here as well. But there is only one big core, and most of them are these smaller cores as presented on the plates. Then there is a whole series of what you could say microlithic tools, and that correspond to the definition of backing and blunting. They are a large portion, and there is also some standardization in the way that they look for the shape of, let's say, trapezes or trapezoids, And Daniel Cahen at the time even saw 3 subtypes within these transverse arrowheads, as they are called, based on the variation between the large la largeur. Thank you. So that there is a way that there are 3 groups based on the measurements, which points to standardization in size as well. They come with other leaf-shaped arrowheads, and also there is a microlithic. So there are larger tools as well made out of this raw material that go together with the transverse arrowheads or the microlithic component. Now, Bateke Plateau is not really an exception in that area. Gombe and more to the south there is also Ndinga and Nzumbi, and we are at the Angolan border. That is also the area where Desmond Clark has worked, and where he also had the sequence from Lupemben and into Chitolian. So what you see is that within the same chronological period, in the same time span, in the same area, there is choice of raw materials, and that depending on the choice of raw material, you end up on one hand with really, let's say, standardized backed and blunted pieces, and on the other hand with small cores, unretouched blades, and also what they have these, sorry, that was the overview of both the components, is the choice for these small quartz cobbles. And in a way, if neocortex is that important, could it be considered as an exploitable alternative for blunting? So in the way that it, so to put it into a handle, that you are not backing or blunting it, but that you are using the neocortex deliberately taken from these cobbles into a haft to find a, let's say, a composite tool. So that is the question: is systematic and recurrent exploitation of neocortex of river cobbles for small flakes with a natural blunted edge a microlithic alternative, which in some way joins the paper of Justin on the use of unretouched small flakes, but in this case with the added value of having a cortex rich. Thank you very much for your attention, and also thank you, of course, to the team of Congo King, who offered me the possibility to finally look at some quartz from the Bas-Congo, because at the museum we only have these large polymorphic sandstone artifacts, and so it's a very genuine feature, let's say, to have when in the area both materials are present, both rocks or both large groups of rocks are exploited, but apparently for different reasons. Thank you.
You mentioned on the Bateke Plateau that it's not blade or blade-like, the products. Are they more flake-like then?
Yeah.
They're small flakes that are then being modified?
Yes.
And they're coming from the radial, some of them from these radial cores?
Some do, yes. There is a large variety of the cores I put, because it's the within the same assemblage you've got a big core and then a series of smaller ones, but there are also some bladelet cores as well, and some non-specialized cores within that assemblage. And so the blanks that were used are more flake fragments than they are blade fragments.
And for the first area where the small quartz cores become, sorry, the first area where the small quartz cores are an exploitation strategy, you said there was a predominance of bipolar in the small core component. The non-cortical core component is mostly bipolar.
Yes.
But the cortical cores are not bipolar?
No.
They're just a freehand.
Yeah.
And you find bipolar in the second area. In the Bateke Plateau, do you also find bipolar in the small cores?
I haven't seen them, so I wouldn't certify that.
So this might be something confined to the first area.
Yes. Yeah. But again, these are not in situ assemblages to the extent that they are neatly defined horizons. It's more, I see it more like a, well, as I said, the subsurface survey of what these quartz assemblages may look like, and of course, for proportions and using, is there more of this or more of that? I think the assemblages, it's a bit unfair to question them from that perspective. It's the general approach that seems to be consistent, but it seems to be consistent in all squares, and a square to me is not a, it's an archaeological unit, but to what does it correspond? I don't think it corresponds to anything that would justify to really subdivide and use percentages or proportions of cores or of flakes as a feature to characterize the assemblage.
But the lack of recognition on the surface of some of this material, is that coming from the sort of Mulvaney problem of we don't see it because it's used in such a way that it becomes invisible to archaeologists, or is it just that it's actually buried underneath the 10 centimeters and you point?
No, I think, and that's true for many of the areas of the Democratic Republic of Congo, many of the information that we have does not come from archaeologists. And so people who walk through and find long foliate points, it's something that immediately attracts the attention, and these objects, these implements will be taken off the surface, whereas a scatter of quartz is not going to attract any attention, and it may still be there. So also, that's why there is this reverse picture of when you look at the surface assemblages, they're not present, and once you start digging, they are present. And that's the same thing in the northeast of the Democratic Republic of Congo, where there were horizons in which these quartz artifacts were found, or in rock shelters, for instance, both in Cameroon and Cameroon. Shumlaka has the same feature of the raw material is present from 30,000 up to the absolute recent periods, but at one point they choose not to use the larger nodules of basalts and trachytes, but to use quartz in exploitation. Again, also for unretouched tools. I mean, it's very difficult to categorize an industry if you don't have this unretouched tools, especially in quartz. So yes, it's an artifact, in fact, that the quartz is not present in surface assemblage because it's not surveys that are conducted with the idea of locating them. Yes, Steve?
Yeah, when you say unretouched tool,
Unretouched tool,
pardon me?
Yes, sorry.
You're saying that it is a tool, as we sometimes refer to, for more refined, formal type tools, versus just an unretouched.
Yeah, an unretouched. Lithic. Yes, an unretouched lithic. Because I have no argument to say that they were used as tools, except that bone from Shango, where I mean, it's obvious. It sits in a bone handle, and it, of course, the thing is, we have never taken out that little quartz insert from the engraved bone, because then it would be damaged. And with more and more technology becoming available, that makes it possible to look into artifacts and so on. We hope that one day we can have a clear idea, but up to this, as far as we can see it, it's unretouched. But it is a tool. But it is a tool.
It is a tool.
The small...
tool on what you said?
That it is in a hand, that it must have been used for something.
Well,
Excuse me?
for all the things you could possibly argue that.
Absolutely, but here the coincidence of it being inserted in a bone, why would you insert it in a bone if you would not use it as a tool? So you're questioning the idea of the engraved bone,
No,
Shango being a tool.
Just question the use of the term.
Referring to the microlith or referring to the bone?
The unretouched tool.
The unretouched tool, okay, I agree with that. But it has been used in a tool.
Yeah.
Semantics, but I think there are...
Descriptive-wise.
Descriptive-wise, I agree absolutely. But the fact that it has been inserted, and it doesn't seem to be retouched the...
Just trying to understand terminology.
I mean, one way to clarify some of this is we have well-designed methods that are used to determine if a piece of stone was used. Micro residues, macro fractures, use work, they've been around for about 100 years now, and we developed them to such an extent that I think if we sample probabilistically these assemblages and take out random samples and do use-work analysis, if indeed these guys are chopping away to produce tools that are used in retouch, we should find patterns in them. And I think from the assemblages we've looked at, when you do that, you do find them. Impact fractures, micro traces, residues maybe not as much where you are else, but we find them in our shelters and in the Levant. Israeli shelters seem to have some of them.
I think shelters would be a better option because these are open air sites.
Yeah.
And so it's the post-deposition of disturbances in that area are considerable. And that hasn't been doing that as well. So again, it's not fine-tuned. There is no problem in trying to do that on this material, but we would always have the argument, yes, but it doesn't come from a sealed stratigraphic position.
I think that, Steve, you're right. We need to be very specific about what we call a tool, lest we go around labeling broken pieces of stone tools.
That's really not my intent.
No, not pointed at you, Els. Just in the general context of our discussion, and I think that is one thing that I would suggest we walk away with is that in this context we really do need to be strict with our definition of tools, and at least try and employ methods to determine if things have been used, and to take subsamples of assemblages to do analysis that is well-founded and has published margins of error associated with it, like the macrofracture stuff that we do, or any of these other techniques. We can at least show that we're trying to not just assume that the tools are, because it is a problem if we're going to include unretouched tools in the definition of microliths. We have to demonstrate they're tools. And if we're going to do that, we need to be strict on ourselves. And I think that this is important.
But once again, I'm not saying that they are tools.
No.
I'm just saying that unretouched quartz fragments have been hafted.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, the graphic studies I showed, and I'm sure Peter has many more of them, or anyone in this room has access to these kinds of observations that we have from modern living history, that humans use tools unretouched all the time. But we can't confine them to a class of artifacts that will never be studied because they're just unretouched. I think we have a good ethnographic reason to believe that these are a part of toolkits, and now the job is to demonstrate that with methods that exist. So we could probably do a macrofracture analysis on some of your pieces.
But what if you don't find anything?
If we don't, then I think we have rounds. At least we tried.
We should move on.
Well, we're at the end of the morning, so this is part of our discussion session. So if anyone, please, we do have 20 minutes, roughly 20 minutes. So if anyone wants to continue the discussion, questions.
Let's just continue the functional discussion around these things. I think a lot of it is not seen, not written about, not spoken about, because of the strict definition of what a tool is in a Stone Age. And I do think we need to get our heads around non-retouched tools, because of what we do not learn if we don't look at these things. Especially when we start to ask the bigger questions about human behavior and what people, if we bring back the people into Stone Age archaeology, then we lose a lot by just not looking at certain categories because they are seen as debitage or waste. So I do think it's a valuable thing. But again, the method and the terminology that we use should be determined by the questions that we ask. That is what we need to start thinking about. Why are we doing this? And that means that it's not always for everybody, but it's the questions that we ask that I think can start playing a role in discussing unretouched tools.
I agree with you. We should try to figure out some way to accommodate these unretouched pieces that clearly show evidence of use. Of course, we have to define what we mean by use. All right. I think it's not simply a way to say it, it's just the questions that were being asked. Because people ask questions, many different questions, and if you don't understand what they're saying, it's kind of useless to know what the questions really are trying to ask if you don't know what they're saying. So there needs to be some kind of standardization of terminology. And I know for Eastern Africa, Desmond Clark always taught us to consider formal or shaped tools as being those that have a standardized retouch. Okay, and then informal or unshaped tools that are more irregular in retouch, but have some retouch of some sort, or quote what we call utilization. Right? I'm just telling you these terms. Now, it does not include what we just heard here, and I think that we should have some kind of category. I would be amenable to another category of some kind of unretouched tool. Anything that shows evidence of use, one way or another, how we define use, should be considered a tool versus debris or debitage or something. I think that's fine.
Once again, I don't want to present this as tools as such in definition, but to me the observation that in an area where you have this variety of raw materials, some are really exploited to produce microliths and others are not, but they are being exploited to what extent, and so is that extent perhaps to produce this kind of flakes that may serve the same purpose as there is behind the classical, let's say, microlith. And also it's a very common feature in Central African archaeology that whenever quartz is involved, it becomes microlithic. So I think it was a nice opportunity to look at this material and see what is really microlithic in that quartz-assemblages from
Maybe what we're doing is maybe we're chasing the wrong target with the concept of tools, because even even pieces that are backed are not always used. So retouch does not guarantee tool use. It can guarantee intentionality, and maybe what we should be chasing after is intentionality. In your area, Els, there is clear intentionality. This is not a random process. People didn't just pick up again and again and again and again the same roughly sized quartz pieces, leave roughly the same amount of cortex on them, reduce roughly the same size cores to bipolar proportion, or to small proportions using bipolar. That's clear intentionality. I think with retouch tools, microliths, the intentionality is very easy. It's retouched. That's a very simple way to demonstrate the intention to miniaturize tools. The other half of the equation, the stuff that isn't retouched, and where assemblages don't consist of large quantities of retouched tools, intentionality is much more difficult to illustrate. And I think here you've illustrated quite nicely the first condition is that it needs to occur in a raw material context where people are not simply predetermined to miniaturization by their geology. Here you've shown that they had options. And the second one is the more tricky one, is use. Was there an intention to then use those small things? We have an ethnographic model that shows that people did use these things, so we can rely on that. And then the sheer preponderance of and prevalence of the technology shows half a degree of intention. And then I think we have a suite of methods that allow us to determine the other half of the intention. And that requires maybe not finding anything, as Steve suggests, but maybe we do find stuff, micro traces, micro fractures. But by then I think we've illustrated 3/4 of intention, and all we're left with is that last quarter that requires a set of methods that don't even work often on retouch tools. So maybe we shouldn't hang ourselves so harshly on searching for tools, but more about intentionality. And I think we have a clear way to get at that. At least 3/4 of the way. I don't know what people think. Steve, Stanley actually had a question that I interrupted. I'm sorry.
Well, it's more of a comment about things that probably go back to the Berg Bordenstein, which I was not at. Maybe Garth, you were there in 1965, 66. The Berg Bordenstein in 1966.
Yeah.
The conference. Were you there?
No, I was digging a hole.
Well, Desmond Clark and Lynn Isaac and a few others wrote a article that was actually twice, once in the South African Archaeological Bulletin, about precision and definition in African archaeology. And this is basically what this is about here today. Some of us use terms very loosely, like microlith, when we mean not only things that have backing, but also things that are just plain small, and not necessarily even blade-like. I'd like to follow the example, which I do not always do, or rarely do actually, is people like David Phillipson, who when he's talking about backed microliths, he'll make it specific that he's talking about something with backing, perhaps regardless of size. And so reduction of terminology may lead to, like Sinha may not clarify anything. Going for fewer words, although this is about microlithic reduction, and may not clarify things. So to say microlith versus backed microlith is quite is just being explicit. And if we're explicit and define our terms at the beginning of a discussion, at the beginning of a publication, maybe we won't have to confront these kinds of issues every time. So I'm guilty of saying it's a microlith when I mean it's something backed, as you'll see in my presentation today, because they're not always very small. Sometimes they're quite large.
You're not guilty. You're using a definition that was...
I'm guilty of imprecision. And I think precision and definition are the keys to effective communication.
But as you know, we were taught to use Mary Dickey's definition in Eastern Africa, which is a microlith is something backed, regardless of its size.
We should learn from our mistakes.
No, this is where we come up with these specific terms. Yeah, but not necessarily the ones that we should continue to use. That's why we're having this discussion. But the Berg Bordenstein symposium was extremely important, and it's not been addressed in 50 years. 50
I guess the problem is that we, and I agree with you, Stan, and it's kind of why I initiated in my talk the idea that we either need to reiterate the definition every single time we write a paper, so that in that paper we know what definition is operationalized. However, I think we then begin to set a precedent that is unparalleled in science, that we use a word to mean many different things in every single context, and therefore we define it each and every time we use it. I think that sciences that have progressed exponentially over the last few decades have done so on the back of concepts that have allowed for the building of knowledge, that are precise and that are shared between researchers without having to be restated every single time that they are used. Unless it's to emphasize the fact that this definition is the topic of the paper. We have a definition for microliths. It is small and retouch tools. That retouch can take the form of backing. It can. I think retouch is a whole category of its own, and we do have a typology for retouch in various parts of the world. It can include backing. There's no reason that backing should be the definition of microliths. We have retouch as the definition of microliths.
But that's what
we need to demonstrate is the size. And that's what no one is focused on. And so if we use the word backed microlith, we take out an implicit component of the definition, which is that it must be small. And I think then if we don't do that, we lose the ability to answer the important evolutionary question is, how does small technology scale along with human biological evolution, which is the hand? I think this is an important question that we haven't been able to address because we throw big and small things into this category, whereas a uniquely derived quality of Homo sapien technologies is the ability to finely manipulate things. That question should drive the research and should drive us to create more accurate terms that focus on size and not on modification strategy.
Justin, I think it's time for you to take the lead in order to take the floor into your own hands. Why don't you ask for a show of hands about a whole series of criteria? I'll just throw one out. 50 mil for the maximum length. Could we see a show of hands of who agrees to that?
Well, Garth, can't we wait until the late afternoon when we bounce all kinds of
I think let's make a compromise between these two strategies. Why don't we? I'll table these suggestions, and we'll put them forward at the end of the day. And
you have a question also? No?
Well, I just wanted to join out of you on talking about intentionality. And there's a whole issue of intentionality that I think we seem to be forgetting is the way in which these things are produced, right? The entire chain of Watteau. And so there's a way that you can show intentionality and intentional shape of both unretouched and retouched products. We have this systematically during, I'm going to talk about what I know, systematically during the Ordination, where you've got productions of what we can call microliths. They will be used unretouched, and they are regularized by retouch for a similar type of function. So I mean, you really need to look into not only intention in terms of use wear, but the entire intention along the entire chain of production. So we need to do it all.
Yeah, absolutely.
Just joining you.
I agree. Yeah, this is not a typological debate, no, and that's what I think we need to remember. We're not trying to define a tool type. We're trying to define a process. And that's exactly what you're saying.
You look systematically at the intentions, at every level of production, not just at the final stage, which is your retouching and your use.
Yep.
I'm just, because I know a bit, and I saw you giving another thing on this for a small group in Johannesburg a while ago, and I'm just wondering, I think not everybody gets the evolutionary importance of small fingers. And perhaps you need to just take a minute or two, because that is the crux, because this is your research question, which may not apply to or make people think in this way, but that is in the end what one can work towards if you think about it. And you explained it very well at a previous occasion about how small the fingers had to be to hold those. And you had another term which I don't want to reveal now, those little cores. And I think that is the crux of what you're trying to make here, but it's never been published, it's never been said. So we need to also think of where this might lead in a bigger scheme of things.
I think I intimated towards the end of the talk some of the importance of this in a broad evolutionary pattern, but I think from my perspective, one of the uniquely derived abilities of Homo sapiens is the ability to finely manipulate objects. I think that we find, if we take the macroevolutionary perspective between chimpanzees and us, that difference is clear. Any of us carrying a chimp-sized stone tool today would be able to do very little with it in terms of manufacturing usable stone artifacts. But this phenomenon we're talking about today, lithic miniaturization, is very body in the late Pleistocene and the lower Pleistocene. It occurs here and a bit there, and it's not a consistent feature until the last 200,000 years, really. My question is that a coincidence that it happens alongside the evolution of our species, and that we haven't found very many Neanderthal sites that show this kind of systematic behavior? We do have a few, but it's never the kind of broad-based patterning that we find elsewhere in the world. I think that this is a big evolutionary question, and that, I think, explains some of why I think it's important, evolutionary. But
you got more finger bones, people.
yes.
Are you proposing that there is a difference in finger size, fingertip size, for example, between Homo erectus or Heidelbergensis versus Homo sapiens?
I'm saying perhaps more close to the Neanderthal Homo sapien boundary. The last 300,000 years, I think, we may find some evolution in finger size. We know from ethnographic populations in southern Africa that they were allometric, they scaled allometrically, body size to hand size, they were smaller. That we find small tools proliferating in the southern African record and in other parts of Africa, more so than probably anywhere else in the world. Our last 70,000 years are defined by small tool production. Is that a coincidence? I think it's a hypothesis that's worth testing, and it's one that has clear guidelines. If we have finger bones, we can test this hypothesis quite easily.
I think that would be quite misleading. The fingertips of chimpanzees are pathetically tiny. And if you just had the skeleton, you would say, these are the kinds of fingertips I would like to have if I was a watchmaker.
But the shape of them is not.
And I think that it's a red herring to go to the Neanderthal modern human transition, because that was 40,000 years ago, and that was in Europe, Eurasia. We're talking about people that we defined as Homo sapiens for 200,000 years in Africa, and there may have been changes in skeletal robusticity. Overall, maybe more facial robusticity than anything else. And I think hands are a constant throughout this time period. The real question is why, after 70,000 years ago or so, do these things proliferate? And I think that's independent of hand size. That's just my take on that.
And I think, again, it's a hypothesis to be tested. I don't think anyone has really addressed it. And I think maybe shape might be a better thing than size, because fingers are certainly not the same shape as ours. While they may be smaller. But again, if we want to answer that kind of question and understand its broader importance, we cannot use the microlith concept as it's currently conceptualized, because retouch tools do not proliferate in the retouched microliths do not proliferate in the lower Pleistocene. But small and retouched tools have an occurrence. And identifying them and studying them as such requires a conceptual framework that allows for it, which we currently don't have.
Just, if you're talking about the end of the Middle Paleolithic, at least in the Levant, at least in one site, such as Amud, where you do have Neanderthals, you do have very small artifacts which are intentionally manufactured. You may not call them microliths, but if you look at the core-trimming elements, if you look at specific cores, you even find bladeless cores which are very, very small. So even though we wouldn't say that they're not predominant and that they're the majority of the industry, because the industry is the Valois, they still do exist and you can't ignore them. And I think that maybe if you would look at other sites at the end of the Middle Paleolithic, you would start seeing this industry appearing. So I think that, again, to go back, I wouldn't directly connect it to Homo sapiens or Neanderthal, but rather some technological change which is occurring, and we may not know what triggers it, but it does start to appear at the end of the middle Paleolithic.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that
to add to that, if you look on that Namagor and all years ago, too small to be true. If you look on flake, tools on flake of in all the southern Levant, on the shell and the shell, many middle Paleolithic sites, you had tension production, really tiny flakes. Some of them look up, some of them not. And for sure, there is not connected to Homo sapiens. So it can be Neanderthal. And not for sure, because it's become a guess, and people say that it's probably even Homo erectus. They know to manipulate really good small things with great determination. So I will not go into editor one for the ability of Homo sapiens in some ways, but those people, those kind of human hominids that have been before, need to choose the right raw material in shape and to produce very tiny flakes systematically, because in fact some of the assemblages, for instance, Ravadin, which is cited by Exeter, corn flake can get like 50%, 60% in tiny flakes. So this is something systematically, I would say, it's not well looked, very flexible. And I think we will speak about it later, but flexibility is very efficient. It's looked opportunistic, but it's very efficient and it's very exciting mindset. I'm not sure I will go into this direction.
Completely. I mean, I think there's two things that come out of what you've said. I think the first is maybe three. The synopodium of borders. We know these things occur in the Middle Paleolithic, and that people have tried to push many times to have them accepted by the community as genuine intentional products, and it's been very difficult because intentionality, at La Pharisee, the tool use component was always the problem. Are these things used? They have the smaller lower cores, they have a small conveyor core, like the conveyor flakes, they have everything to show that this is intentional. But the problem is that the cases you cite are incredibly important for understanding the long-term evolutionary occurrence of these technologies. But we've lost sight of their interconnectedness. We've lost the ability to compare them between sites and to think of them in a big picture perspective because we don't have a concept for them. They get swept underneath the bigger reduction strategies. We haven't, for example, the microliths concept has a far more pervasive comparative phenomenon. Researchers from around the world have again and again compared how microliths are made, where they proliferate, but we haven't done nearly the same thing for the occurrence of small and retouch toolkits. I think simply because they become idiosyncratic of each assemblage, instead of being a phenomenon that might actually be connected to something maybe broader than Homo sapiens. Yes, maybe. I'm not, for me, this was just a hypothesis that can be tested. If it's not true, I think before hominids decided to walk upright, we find many examples of them walking in some way like it. It doesn't mean that they were bipedal. Bipedalism becomes a main factor of Homo evolution later on. I think in the same case we might have small occurrences of miniaturization before the impetus for it to become a big part of our evolution takes hold in the late Pleistocene. But we can't lose sight of the connectedness of these long-term processes by simple terminology.
In order to identify non-retouch small tools that would occur before the microliths, we have a problem of terminology, but we have also a problem of method, I think, because it needs a lot of training and a lot of time in order to properly identify used artifacts. And unfortunately, only a few of us have the ability to determine use word. And that's a problem. That's not new. That's been a problem for decades. But as long as none of us is able to get rid of this constraining framework of classifying retouched things, we are not going to be able to include fully the non-retouched artifacts in the discussion. We will have great examples where unretouched artifacts were obviously used, but we will not have the, we won't be able to integrate all of them.
Can I just respond to that?
Yeah.
Just to say, I think that maybe we shouldn't be so focused on the tool components, demonstrating what are tools and what are not tools. I think intentionality is the thing we should be going for. And with unretouched miniaturization, it consists of 4 factors. The first is raw material context. Does this occur in a context where humans are not predetermined to making small things already by the nature of their geology? And I think even that shouldn't be a factor mitigating against its use as an example of miniaturization, because humans choose to live where they live. So even though the raw material context might be completely small, there are no big nodules of rocks, humans chose to be there. So that is a tricky, the geology is a tricky aspect, but I think the clearest way is to show that there are bigger options for methods, like you've shown clearly at your sites. The second thing is to demonstrate the chain of control, the intentionality to produce the objects themselves. Is there a systematic production here? Or is this simply a byproduct of the production of a big core and small things are resulting? Again, I think there's an issue there because, yes, maybe they're not meaning to make these in the beginning, but small flakes are still used from big reduction sequences. So there's a nuance there, but the clearest approach is to show that indeed, from the beginning to the end, the intention was to manage the core modification process to make small things. The third aspect is that we have an ethnographic model that shows humans in protohistorical periods were predisposed to using small tools and retouch. Now you might say these are influenced by colonialism and contact periods, and that's true for many parts of the world. However, in Australia, the example I showed you of Smythe's work in the 18th century, there's another ethnography I didn't show you, which is by a man called Mitchell. Just after this, in the early 1900s, after the weight of European archaeology was stronger in Australia, and his ethnography, unretouched tool use is not mentioned a single time. The only thing that we find in his ethnography are BAP tools. So nothing changed about the technology of the people they were looking at. What changed was the mindset. And so I think contact actually took small retouch tools out of the equation rather than added them. And so we could rely on an ethnographic model that shows humans use small and retouched tools frequently and often use them unhafted. The fourth thing, and this is only once we've gone through these clearly demonstrable processes that don't have as many hiccups with them, we get to useware. It's the fourth of the 4 required components of intentionality. So once we get to useware, we should have already demonstrated those other 3 things clearly. And when we get to useware, we don't need to spend 4 years doing it. There's a method in statistics, probabilistic sampling. We go through an assemblage and we sample probabilistically. We take 30 pieces at random from various, with a research question in mind, and we use methods like the macrofracture method. Takes 10 minutes to analyze a tool. Not even that, 5 minutes. Now look, it's not the method that's going to answer all questions, but it will tell you if tools were used for hunting. In fact, for the last 40 years, it's the only method that's really told us this consistently. So if we want to ask just are tools used for hunting, we can do this using 5 minutes on each tool. And that's times 25 tools. My math is terrible, I'm not going to even attempt it, but that's not a lot of time. And then if we use other techniques like micro-CT scanning, which we can do a piece in 30 minutes now with micro-CT scanning, those scans can answer functional questions. Danielle MacDonald's work at the University of Tulsa is showing this. Her work in the Near East, they've done hundreds of pieces, and they show polishes, variations. So I don't think the microwave is such an obstacle, and I think even if it is, we've got 3 other lines of evidence to show intentionality. We shouldn't get hung up on tools. I think we should be focusing on intentionality. That's something we can actually answer with archaeological data and ethnographic models.
I agree with you. I just want to add that I don't know regarding the use where if we rely on microscopic images, we end up having the hunting activities overrepresented.
Sure.
And that's an important, yes.
Of course, but we have that in the phone.
Because yes, we can recognize obvious damage scars or the things, but none of us can recognize the discrete luxury.
Of course, yeah, and I think this is, again, we might overrepresent hunting, but again, we have a theoretical model to account for that. We can start off the analysis by saying the results that you're about to see overrepresent hunting, but they don't disqualify it. So Steve had a response.
I wish my colleague Deirdre Roach was here because, as you know, she's very concerned about the misuse of useware, microware, particularly residue analyses by untrained archaeologists. And I've seen article after article, including some from departments that we know very well, where supposedly training in microfracture is done. And yet, there are still significant problems. It's not something easy to understand and quickly take up, not for everybody. There's also, so I think it's very difficult, in fact, to get at, useware microware analyses by a common, everyday archaeologist, you could say. Also, there's also logistical problems. As some of my colleagues from Ethiopia who are here will know very well, that we've been trying for almost 2 years now to export 15 artifacts, projectile points, which have residue and microware from Ethiopia to Belgium to analyze them in many different ways that we cannot do in the laboratories in SAfA for many reasons. It's not no fault of the Ethiopians by any means, but we've still not been able to do so. And so I think we finally have received approval, and we finally will be able to get some out. But we need many more than just 15 to understand what's going on. And so it's also a question of logistics and problems such as that we face in Africa that many people don't realize exist.
Did you have a comment?
I appreciate your belief in the microwave, but we still await the time that 2 people will look at the same assemblage and will come with the same answer. But I think it's well established that people in the Ashelian are systematically producing tiny things. They should not have called, they were probably hafted. You mentioned Kesem as, tiny little things that were used, if we believe microwave, and were used for butchering. So I think we're way beyond that assumption. The ability to systematically produce and use micro artifacts is well within the ability of these people in the Ashelian already. So I think the concept of there's something to do with the evolution of the hand. I go back to your first slide with the 3 little micro nano things on the fingertip, which are way too small for us to use even. So I think it will be much more fruitful to look at it. If you say that the world is run by microliths or mini tools in the last 70,000 years, it's probably because they had the need There's something with the functionality, something with a different kind of food, something with different environment, something with, they have the need to produce and use these. And I think the point is that coming from the Levant, and looking at the microliths of the Levant, and I think we have a good definition for microliths in the Levant, back, not back, everything, is that microliths enable us for the first time to see difference between different groups. So it has some kind of, instead of these, we talked about even the Iranian is like worldwide, but here for the first time when they start producing what we call microliths, you can see actually difference between groups on a small scale. And this is, they are all more than humans, it has nothing to do with the evolution of their hand or the fingers, but I think it will be much more fruitful to go in these directions than in the biology.
Could you give us that definition of microliths that you used? I'm sure.
This is the point of the workshop.
Yeah. Which is? North African?
Yeah, the platelet are the platelet weights when you have average is 12 and it belong until 5 centimeters, and if it's real touch, 9
It doesn't work
yeah, it's not.
cases.
Yeah.
Can I have a...
Yeah, I'm not stating...
You're just giving the definition.
Yeah.
Then if you're going
by common language, huh?
No, this is for common language.
Okay.
Okay, we'll maybe discuss later, but when we did in the negative and Sinha, the refitting, you see that this boundary are not exist because in the same core, small core, they are doing both blade and platelets. It's the same industry, same intention, and sometimes the platelet will be in a blade size, so you must be flexible. But if you look on the strict definition, this is the definition.
What it means is another thing. What it
means.
means.
This is the definition of fixia.
But didn't he have a reason for making that at those numbers? That there was a bimodal, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a bimodal distribution that separated out the larger from the smaller, and that was very important. And we need to start looking for things like that.
And it's very easy. Length with plots
I
are...
think it's, for me, we are coming from the Levant, when we started with Kuhn and Ashton, we worked with them a lot in school, but there was Tixia before. So, and I think that the advantage of Tixia is someone that coming from, let's say, melange history, because in the Levant you have Gabbard, and you have the Americans after working, and you have the French. So we are all split. We don't know who we are in the moment.
That's why you are very flexible. You do
yeah.
It's better that way. It's better that way. Huh?
This is why the country is so successful, you know. So now I forget what I wanted to say. but when you look, now I really don't.
Definition. Change your ID. You're so flexible that you can change. It's time for coffee. Yeah. I think just to respond to the last.
I know what I wanted to say. When you look in the end at what Tixia did, he connected North Africa to the Levant, to Europe. So, and Steve spoke about it before, the communication. So when we define microviewing technique, and when we started working together in '98, we came and said, okay, the definition of blades, there was there was never any question that we are speaking on the same thing. Then we can argue that the strict definition was to start with the same book, and everybody in the room knows what it is. I think it's
this is what we're working towards today. Just to respond to the question of why, I think my intention today was not to bring questions of why to the room. I framed my talk in what I thought was a reason for us being here, but I really don't want us to get distracted by why people are making small tools. So if we could perhaps agree to keep the why questions out of the debate today, because I think that they are important, but they're so contextual that if each one of us wants to answer this question, it's going to require different evidence. And that I'm not saying that we need this definition because this thing evolved with Homo sapiens. I think we need it because of the reason you just said. We all need to be in the same room talking about the same thing, and at the moment we're not. And that's why we're here. So the debate about why people made small things is an important one, but it's not the focus of today's workshop. So I'm sorry that I hijacked the discussion earlier about hands and things like that, but this is my brain. It's not going to be the focus of today. So I think we can make much more progress by focusing on the definitions.
Microlithic because the blanks are that small, and because of its shattering nature, let's say, that it breaks away in small portions. Now the site I will be talking about is situated over here, in Ngongo Mbata, one of the many sites of the sites over here that yielded some of these lithic assemblages in the south of Bakongo. On the slide here, you don't see it very well, but these are the big trenches that were dug for the project itself, and the graph in Excel table, which is presented above it, is the presence of the lithic artifacts throughout these various trenches, and each column of an Excel file corresponds to a square meter, and in the grey shaded areas are the numbers of lithic artifacts that were collected throughout the sediment. In the red colored square, the spits, in fact, the lines in the Excel graph are 10 to 20 centimeter spits, and the date comes from a depth between 120 and 140 centimeters below surface. There are at about 785 artifacts, and thereof 88% was made of quartz, generally speaking. That means vein quartz, milky quartz, and also to some extent glass quartz or the crystal quartz. Another feature that is very apparent looking at this material is the very high proportion of cortex on all of the artifacts, and as we will see, regardless of size and regardless of type. In general, the largest size classes that are found in both raw materials, that means there is a smaller portion of other raw materials which are more like the silicified mudstone or the finer grained flint-like raw materials. And you see that the size distribution of these two groups of raw materials here at this site is approximately the same, although the other raw materials in general on a regional scale are also present in much larger blocks and much larger blanks. Now, when comparing all the other raw materials, there's only 90 of them, to the 695 artifacts in quartz, arranged according to size expressed in centimeters. You see that the no cortex here with the quartz is up to 2 centimeters, but that there is a vast majority of cortical pieces. So what do they look like? Which does not correspond with the other raw materials, where you see that the cortex is more evenly spread and, let's say, becomes more important, which would be logical if you want to get rid of your cortex in the larger size classes. I think it's the idea. I'm going to present in this session on microliths a recently, let's say, excavated, not precisely, but subsurface surveyed assemblages from the Bas Con. and also present you with the general criteria that I have been using whilst looking at the material from this area of the Bas Congo in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And I am referring to the publication or the introduction by Els Cornelissen in 2002 on what they propose as criteria for describing microlithic assemblages. There is the proliferation of bladelet and microblade techniques, the fact that there are retouched implements and that the retouch serves to blunt rather than to sharpen the artifacts or the implements, that the combination of these two leads to more standardization both in shape and in size, or in shape and size, that microlithic pieces tend to make up a substantial and often numerically dominant component of lithic assemblages described as microlithic, although they are used along with microlithic tools. And then also, of course, that microliths are used in composite tools. The data that I will be presenting, on one hand the quartz assemblages and on the other hand the Chitolian from the Bas Congo, you will see that one of these, the Chitolian, corresponds rather nicely to these criteria, whereas the quartz assemblages don't at all correspond to that. Now, the area I will be talking about is the Bas Congo, the most western part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. As you can see, this area is relatively well covered with archaeological sites compared to the rest of the country, but very much also here it's an archaeology of presence and absence. It's not an overwhelming offer of well-dated sites in stratigraphy. Now, the Bas Congo is known ever since the late 19th century for the surface collections and the pieces that are literally littering the place, which are made in a gripolymorph or a polymorphic sandstone, which is available in all kinds of sizes, small nodules, but also very big ones, and has been used for bifacially flaked implements of the Sangoan, Lupemban, Chitolian tradition. So this very much to insist that also in this area, quartz is not a matter of a last resort or being used because there is nothing else available. However, these quartz assemblages are not very visible in the, let's say, surface collections. And Bas Congo, that's the same all over the Democratic Republic of Congo. And in fact, there is now a project, a Congo Kingdom project running in the Bas Congo, who has nothing to do with Stone Age research, but is looking for the origins of the Congo Kingdom. But during the excavations for stratigraphic position of the graves and the churches and the walls they found, they also collected quartz industry or stone or lithic artifacts, and they also dated on one of these sites, Ngongo Mbata, the lithics to approximately 9,000 years ago. So we're in the Holocene. That's also the scope, the chronological scope of my presentation. It's the Holocene in between, let's say, 12,000 and 3,000. Now, it has been published last year in a more general presentation of the project as artifacts of late Stone Age origin associated to microlithic quartz debitage. The charcoal was dated to 9,470. And the question of the team of Congo King was for me to look at this lithic material, to study and analyze it. So it's a very timely opportunity, this workshop on microlithic, to describe and to look into more detail of these lithics. For quartz in general, usually it is said it looks